Hey guys, I'm Elizabeth, the curly-haired country gal. I'm in my second year of natural beekeeping, natural treatment-free beekeeping. For my first year, I bought a bunch of supplies from Dr. Leo after his March workshop. But now that homestead funds are a little tighter, it's time to build my own frames as I expand my apiary. So this isn't going to be a step-by-step tutorial on how to make the frames, but I hope that it helps, especially if you're an amateur woodworker like I am, to know that especially if you have a guide the first time, it is going to be possible for you to make your own frames. This was a really scary process for me, but thankfully Monty, the suburban sodbuster, was there to help. Now Monty's my friend and bee mentor, and he was very gracious to offer to let me come up and help me just see the process of building frames. And when we were there, he said, well, is there anything in particular that I can help you with? Because I do want to be able to build frames myself in the future.
There is no such thing as level 0.
And I said, well, it's things like making sure I measure correctly, taking the width of the blade into consideration. And what is a dado? Am I even saying that right? And how do I wire the frames?
There is now a level 0.
The day arrived and it was time to head to Monty's place. So one of my daughters came with me. We packed her like a sardine in the back of the car and we headed out. Okay, it's a brisk Monday morning on spring break and my daughter and I are headed out to see Monty the suburban sodbuster to make some frames. And once we got there, Monty's dog greeted us in true dog fashion.
I have just met you, and I love you.
And the dog and Amina hit it off like great pals all day. As I mentioned a couple times in a previous video talking about how I keep all these projects going and organized on the homestead, I mentioned that I was able to pick up a lot of raw lumber. So I thought, awesome, I'm gonna make it work to use this raw lumber to make these frames for really inexpensive. So I got myself a sander for the first time. I even read the directions. Jared was so proud. And I set out some boards to be able to dry, and I sanded these boards down. They went from looking like this to looking like this, and I even got the kids in on it with me, and the cats even hung out with us. But once we arrived, Monty and I figured out that because of how the plans are laid out, it would have been a really inefficient use of wood to try to use this rough cut lumber. So all that work ended up being for naught, but thankfully Monty had a backup, which was great planning on his part, and so we were still able to continue. So Monty asked, okay, well, should we start with something that's more difficult or something that's easier? And I said, please, let's start with something that's easier. So we started with the bottom bars. That's really simple, really straightforward. You just cut a lot of these simple rectangles. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of sawdust involved. The next thing that we cut were the side bars, which do get kind of tricky, and we'll talk more about that later, but they started again with a rectangle based on Dr. Leo's plans from horizontalhive.com. So after quite a few cuts and patiently working away on the table saw, we had a pile of bottom bars and we had a pile of side bars. And one of Monty's hives was the involuntary volunteer of all of these supplies. And it was fun to see those bees getting active as the day warmed up. It was a little windy, if I remember correctly, but it was a beautiful day to work. Then it was time to cut the rabbits into the top bars. So after Monty measured the height of the blade based on Dr. Leo's instructions, he carefully cut the board, and I was watching like a hawk to see how he did it without cutting his fingers off. Along the way, I was feverishly taking some notes, but my daughter still had a chance to make some drawings of her own, so she drew this lovely dog. So then after making the vertical cuts, he re-measured the height of the blade so that we could make the horizontal cuts along those future top bars to make sure that everything gets cut out correctly. Now after just one or two cuts, we took a look at it to see if everything matched up really nicely on that board. In the first one or two, because of the height of the blade, there was a little bit of a lip left on the future top bar, and he pointed out that you really need to make that a clean cut, because as you try to assemble it, if there's that little hill in the wood, it's not gonna come together very quickly. So we had to get some chisels out for the first couple just to get that nice and flush so that it would be easier to finish. Despite our best efforts, we found that we still ended up with the boards being pretty uneven at the ends. We have some lovely homemade shims though. And then once or twice, the blade actually got stuck and stalled out. So Monty happened to have this lube spray that we could put on it to keep the blade working properly. And along the way, there were plenty of snacks involved, and my daughter brought along quite a few toys that she got to play with on a stump in Monty's yard. And then, after the first mountain that we had to climb, Monty brought out the jig to taper the sides of the sidebars. Dr. Leo may explain this in his directions, but Monty kind of explained and showed how, because of how the jig is set up, the wood will start going in straight, and then it will come up and end where the block is at the end and be tapered. So it was a little snug at first because we must have cut the sidebars a little bit too wide for some of them, but Monty was able to get that adjusted, thankfully. Then, before we were able to do that, it was time to set up the dados. Now, I know I said this wrong, incorrectly, when we were making the hives in that video. I think maybe I called them dados. I forget. And somebody in the comments was like, it's a dado, I think. So I hope I'm saying it right now. But I did not realize what dado blades look like. I thought they were just a normal looking blade. I didn't realize that they looked like ninja stars. But anyway, Monty was able to stack, I think, a normal blade and then kind of like a washer, and then a dado blade, and then a washer, and then another dado blade, and then the end, something like that, to make the width that we needed. I think it was about 1/2 inch. And then he secured the jig on with some clamps. Oh, look who came to say hi, it's Pixel. Hey, buddy. Oh, okay, sorry. But then Monty was able to run the first one through and just show how, again, it just runs through the jig, stops, and then you've got your taper. So then it was just that times 120. Now, at that point, the hard part of the cuts was over, and then it was just time to put a bunch of holes into the top bars and bottom bars with the drill press for assembly. Monty had this great jig that he set up where he put these lines so that we would know exactly where to line it up in the front, shift it, make a second hole, shift it again, make the third and then fourth holes with 2 other lines. So that went really smoothly. We don't have a drill press, so maybe I'll line up a bunch of the top bars and bottom bars and then use a chalk line at the correct measurements, but I'm gonna have to use a regular drill for that. As I completed them, I put them into this box. Now, for the bottom bars, it was important to note that you were supposed to cut into the wider side, not to the taller side. So thankfully, Monty has an assembly jig, which he also followed Dr. Leo's directions to make, as well as a wiring jig. So those are 2 more things that I know I need to make, Lord willing, this year to be able to make my own frames next year. So it was just helpful to see one, to touch it, and have a little bit more confidence to make my own. And so some videos will be coming out on that in the next few months as well, Lord willing. So we put some wood glue on the ends, put it in the assembly jig. My wonderful videographer caught some footage of that, used the narrow crown staple gun, and got those secured. Now, I handed the camera off to my videographer and asked her to, get some shots of us working. And then she got a little distracted.
Squirrel!
But we got a lovely tour of Monty's yard. And then she took some lovely photos, including all of these. Lots of the dog, as you can imagine. And then some other things that she found interesting. I found this one particularly eye-catching. But eventually, she did make her way back to us as we continued working away on assembling. The day was starting to draw to an end. We had assembled a pretty good number of frames, and it was time to wire them. The biggest thing that Monty wanted to get across with the wiring was that you really want to get the wire farthest from the end of the assembly jig tight the first time, get it off of the ceramic insulator, and then kind of be done with it, and then go to the next one and just go one at a time, do it well, and then leave it alone. He also pointed out that one trick that he found helpful was for the wire at the end to go on the outside of the nail as opposed to the inside of the nail, so that it doesn't cross over the frame and potentially cause some problems. So we arrived at maybe 9 o'clock, and at this point it was maybe 4 in the afternoon, and my brain just really wanted to keep going. I had hoped that we could get all 60 frames done in one day. That was optimistic, but my body was like, no, it's time to be done. It's time to go home. I was tired. I could feel it. But I was so thankful to have 10 or 12 assembled frames in the back of the car, plus another 10 or 12 frames that were fully wired. Complete. Then we had a nice little bonus right before leaving. My daughter got to pet some more dogs, which she loves. And here is the man of the hour who was such a big help in making frames. Thanks, Monty. You're the best. And then on the way home, there was a beautiful sunset, and I again asked my videographer if she would do her best to capture it, and this is what she got.
I am simply at peace. Finally.
I know it's still going to be a lot of work. That was several weeks ago now that I went to Monty's, and I still have boxes of unassembled frames. And I still need to make the wiring jig and make the assembly jig, but at least now I kind of have a vision of what to do. Thanks for watching. Of course, check out Monty's channel. He's super knowledgeable when it comes to natural beekeeping and gardening. And if you've enjoyed this, go ahead and like it down below. Thanks. We'll see you next time. Whipper-wheel, whipper-wheel. Can you hear that?